Okay, so this is my presentation for the Void class taken with Professor Katherine Everitt. And so what are we doing here? Um, I want to start first by thinking about the way that when we are born, each of us can watch this video right now, um, we're kind of thrown into the world as it is in the way that history has taken shape. And we are born into certain educational institutions, certain forms of the workplace, certain like cultural climates, and we're presented with these things like ready made. And this is, one of the great insights of sociology and socialization, is the way that the way the world works, um, is a leads to a reification of sorts. It appears to us as this is just the way things are, um, and we don't recognize the contingency of it. Um, and as Foucault expertly demonstrates in Discipline and Punish, there's all these like micro processes with exercising an infinitesimal power upon us. For instance, like the school, we develop certain aptitudes, certain skills, ways of thinking, that really shape our rationality in certain ways. We think about like we're raised to think, of to have empathy and to think about others in the way they want to be treated. But if you go into any AP economics class in the U.S., um, you know, you'd more properly name that class capitalist economics. Um, my teacher um, spent about like half a class day talking about alternate forms of organizing a society than capitalism. Um, and so there's really that's what makes here I'm going to transition to Locke, who I spend the first half of this paper discussing, and how when we read Locke from our contemporary point of view in a Western capitalist society in particular is what I'm referring to as that's my position in the world. Um, holds a lot, seems to hold a lot of weight. Men are all naturally in the state of perfect freedom. This is the classic humanist position. Um, Classic is in like archetypal. And freedom to order our actions, dispose of our possessions. Um, he's asserting the sovereignty of reason over passions. Um, and he goes on to say, you know, later in the novel, in his idea of the state, the liberal democratic state, which would, of course, go on to greatly influence the USA's founding fathers, that it's actually um, property owners who should be the exclusive class comprising the state, the legislative state who makes laws, um, because the state is there to protect property, which of course, um, you know, he conceives of the self as the property of ourself and our possessions, as the most important things to protect, in life, and also like the only things we have like the moral authority to assert are, you know ours, or that we have any ability to arbitrate on. But he conveniently invokes the apparent fact that the wage laboring class, the working class, is, uh, even though there's this universal equality in a certain aspect, there's not an equality of reasoning between the property class and the laboring class, because the laboring class, who, living hand to mouth, paycheck to paycheck, whatever you want to call it, they can never raise their thoughts above that life of subsistence. And moreover, he invokes a spiritual doctrine, his interpretation of God, who um, and also like paternity, and saying that like only when a child can shift for themselves, take care of themselves, provide for themselves, are they no longer under the authority of the parent. Same thing as with like God, you know, because we can't ever shift for ourselves and provide for us in the way God does, we can never not be under God's authority. And likewise, someone who doesn't own property can't be a member of the state that is supposed to arbitrate and protect property. So it's almost like there's this like rhetorical craft work he does to do that. And so, what does this mean when we think of all these things together? Um, One important thing to note is Locke is not a thinker of the void, but he also kind of is in the really interesting sense. So he's not a thinker of the void in this metaphysical axiom here. He says very assertingly, he says men have like this perfect freedom, reason over passion. You know, um, this is like the nature of humankind, right? So he's not a thinker of the void, but then he is a thinker of the void when he talks about the laborer. He says that, you know, he kind of invokes like the laborer's lack of experience, um, and he says they're void of reason. You know, so he kind of like flip flops in order to arrive at like these opposing conclusions. And you know, he also interestingly he bases his conclusion of the laborer and their lack of reason on like an empirical induction rather than his this statement, which uses a theoretical deduction, even though he's just kind of starting from this point. So he's like using evidence from anecdotal evidence in one place, not using it in another place. And C.V. McPherson, who made great work on Hobbes and Locke, um, identifies this, you know, by finding that like Locke actually reads his time, the society of his time, onto like the essential state of like human history, not really recognizing its contingency, and how like um, just to go back to what I was discussing at the start, like you and I, you know, born into the school, created into these particular subjects who have these particular aptitudes and have to think about the world in like a economic way in order to like advance and just to even earn a living. Like we have to learn that we have to develop this aptitude, and we don't have time oftentimes to work on other aptitudes. And so he, you know, someone like Locke or someone like reading Locke who finds it really compelling might see that like people act this way and this is just how they are, right? Or this is just how like the proletarian class, like this is just how they think. But they don't recognize that when we're like thrown into the world, like we act on survival first and we reflect after. You know, it's not the other way around. We don't come into the world, drop in, like thinking so hard and reasoning. Like you don't see 6-year-olds philosophizing about how like, hey, like why can't I like spend my free time like growing food instead of playing like math, like worksheets all day, right? So there's kind of like this contingent like thrownness that we're necessitates that we act in a certain way, develop our rationalities, and of course, you know, in thinking this void, we recognize like the possibility for other forms of life, and that's really powerful. And of course, as Marx would show um, in the mid 19th century and subsequently following in the early 20th, you know, the worker is actually like can be so much more than what he had appeared to be according to Locke. So that's the intro to my paper.